The Love of My Life by Coraghessan Boyle. They wore each other like a pair of socks. He was at her house, she was at his. Everywhere they went, to the mall, to the game, to movies and shops and classes that structured their days like a new kind of chronology. Their fingers were entwined, their shoulders touching, their hips joined in the slow, triumphant sachet of love. He drove her car, slept on the couch in the family room at her parents' house, played tennis and watched football with her father on the big 36-inch TV in the kitchen. She went shopping with his mother and hers, a triumvirate of tastes, and she would have played tennis with his father if it came to it, but his father was dead. "I love you," he told her, because he did, because there was no feeling like this, no triumph, no high. It was like being immortal and unconquerable, like floating. And 100 times a day she said it too. "I love you, I love you." They were together at his house one night when the rain froze on the streets and sheathed the trees in glass. It was her idea to take a walk and feel it in the hair and the glistening shoulders of their parkas, another worldly drumming of pellets flung down out of the troposphere, alien and familiar at the same time. And they glided the length of the front walk and watched the way the power lines bellied and swayed. He built a fire when they got back, while she toweled her hair and made hot chocolate laced with Jack Daniels. They'd rented a pair of slasher movies for the ritualized comfort of them. Teens have sex, he said, and then they pay for it in body parts. And the maniac had just climbed out of the heating vent with a meat hook dangling from the recesses of his empty sleeve when the phone rang. It was his mother, calling from the hotel room in Boston where she was curled up, shacked up, for the weekend with the man she'd been dating. He tried to picture her, but he couldn't. He even closed his eyes a minute to concentrate, but there was nothing there. Was everything all right, she wanted to know, with the storm and all? No, it hadn't hit Boston yet, but she saw on the Weather Channel that it was on its way. 2 seconds after he hung up, before she could even hit the start button on the VCR, the phone rang again, and this time it was her mother. Her mother had been drinking. She was calling from a restaurant, and China could hear a clamor of voices in the background. "Just stay put," her mother shouted into the phone. "The streets are like a skating rink. Don't you even think about getting in that car." Well, she wasn't thinking of it. She was thinking of having Jeremy to herself all night in the big bed in his mother's room. They'd been having sex ever since they started going together at the end of their junior year, but it was always sex in the car or sex on a blanket or the lawn, hurried sex, nothing like she wanted it to be. She kept thinking of the way it was in the movies, where the stars ambushed each other on beds the size of small planets, then did it again and again until they lay nestled in a heap of pillows and blankets, her head on his chest, his arm flung over her shoulder, the music fading away to individual notes plucked softly on a guitar, and everything in the frame glowing as if it had been sprayed with liquid gold. That was how it was supposed to be. That was how it was going to be, at least for tonight. She'd been wandering around the kitchen as she talked, dancing with the phone in an idle, slow saraband, watching the frost sketch a design on the window over the sink. No sound but the soft hiss of the ice pellets on the roof. And now she pulled open the freezer door and extracted a pint box of ice cream. She was in her socks so thick they were like slippers, and a pair of black leggings under an oversized sweater. Beneath her feet the polished floorboards were slick as the sidewalk outside, and she liked the feel of that, skating indoors in her big socks. "Uh-huh," she said into the phone. "Uh-huh. Yeah, we're watching a movie." She dug a finger into the ice cream and stuck it in her mouth. "Come on," Jeremy called from the living room, where the maniac rippled menacingly over the pause button. "You're going to miss the best part." "Okay, Mom, okay," she said into the phone, parting words, and then hung up. "You want ice cream?" she called, licking her finger. Jeremy's voice came back at her, a voice in the middle range, with a congenital scratch in it. The voice of a nice guy, a very nice guy, who could be the star of a TV show about nice guys. What kind? He had a pair of shoulders and pumped-up biceps, too. A smile that jumped from his lips to his eyes, and close-cropped hair that stood up straight off the crown of his head. And he was always singing. She loved that. His voice so true that he could do any song. And there was no lyric he didn't know, even on the oldies station. She scooped ice cream and saw in him a scene from last summer, one hand draped casually over the wheel of his car, the radio throbbing, his voice raised in perfect sync with Billy Corgan's, and the night standing still at the end of a long dark street overhung with maples. Chocolate, Swiss chocolate almond. Okay, he said. Then he was wondering if there was any whipped cream or maybe hot fudge. He was sure his mother had a jar stashed away somewhere. Look behind the mayonnaise on the top row. And when she turned around, he was standing in the doorway. She kissed him. They kissed whenever they met, no matter where or when, even if one of them had just stepped out of the room, because that was love. That was the way love was. And when they took 2 bowls of ice cream into the living room and with a flick of the remote, set the maniac back in motion. It was in early spring that year. The world had gone green overnight, the thermometer twice hitting the low 80s in the first week of March. Teachers were holding sessions outside. The whole school, even the halls and the cafeteria, smelled of fresh mowed grass and the unfolding blossoms of the fruit trees in the development across the street. And students, especially seniors, were cutting class to go out to the quarry or the reservoir, or just drive the back streets with the sunroof and the windows open wide. But not China. She was hitting the books, studying late, putting everything in its place like pegs in a board. Even love, even that. Jeremy didn't get it. Look, you've already been accepted at your first choice school. You're going to wind up in the top 10 GPA-wise, and you've got 4 years of tests and term papers ahead of you in grad school after that. You'll only be in high school senior once in your life. Relax, enjoy it, or at least experience it. He'd been accepted at Brown, his father's alma mater, and his own GPA would put him at the top 10% of their graduating class, and he was content with that, skating through his final semester, no math, no science, taking art and music, the things he'd always wanted to take but never had time for, and lit, of course, AP History and Spanish 5. Tu eres el amor de mi vida, he would tell her when they met at her locker at lunch, or when he picked her up for a movie on Saturday nights. Y tú también, she would say, or is it yo también? French was her language. But I keep telling you, it really matters to me, because I know I'll never catch Marjorie Yu or Christian Davenport. I mean, they're a lock for Val and Salute, but it'll kill me if people like Carrie Sharp or Jalopy Seagrand finish ahead of me. You should know that, you of all people. It amazed him that she actually brought her books along when they went backpacking over spring break. They'd planned the trip all winter, and through the long wind tunnel that was February, packing away freeze-dried entrees, power bores, Gore-Tex windbreakers, and matching sweatshirts, weighing each item on a handheld scale with a dangling hook at the bottom of it. They were going up into the Catskills, to a lake he'd found on a map, and they were going to be together without interruption. Without telephones, automobiles, parents, teachers, friends, relatives, and pets, for 5 full days. They were going to cook over an open fire. They were going to read to each other and burrow into the double sleeping bag, with the connubial zipper up the seam he'd found in his mother's closet. A relic of her own time in the lap of nature. It smelled of her, of his mother, a vague scent of her perfume that had lingered there dormant all these years. And maybe there was the faintest whiff of his father, too. Though his father had been gone so long, he didn't even remember what he looked like, let alone what he might have smelled like. 5 days, and it wasn't going to rain, not a drop. He didn't even bring his fishing rod, and that was love. When the last bell rang down the curtain on Honor's Math, Jeremy was waiting at the curb in his mother's Volvo station wagon, grinning up at China through the windshield, while the rest of the school swept past with no thought for anything but release. There were shouts and curses, T-shirts in motion, slashing legs, horns bleating from seniors' lot. The school buses lined up like armored vehicles awaiting the invasion. Chaos, sweet chaos. But she stood there a moment to savor it. Your mother's car, she said, slipping in beside him and laying both arms over his shoulders to pull him to her for a kiss. He'd brought her jeans and hiking boots along, and she was going to change as they drove. No need to go home. No more circumvention and delay. A stop at McDonald's, maybe, or Burger King, and then it was the sun and the wind and the moon and the stars. 5 days. 5 whole days. "Yeah," he said, in answer to her question. "My mother said she didn't want to have to worry about us breaking down in the middle of nowhere." "So she's got your car? She's going to sell real estate in your car?" He just shrugged and smiled. "Free at last," he said, pitching his voice down low till it was exactly like Martin Luther King's. "Thank God Almighty, we are free at last." It was dark by the time they got to the trailhead, and they wound up camping just off the road in a rocky trumble of brush. No place on earth less likely or less comfortable, but they were together, and they held each other through the damp, whispering hours of the night and hardly slept at all. They made the lake by noon the next day, the trees just coming into leaf, the air sweet with the smell of sun in the pines. She insisted on setting up the tent just in case. It could rain, you never knew. But all he wanted to do was stretch out on a gray neoprene pad and feel the sun on his face. Eventually, they both fell asleep in the sun, and when they woke, they made love right there, beneath the trees, with the wide blue expanse of the lake giving back the blue of the sky. For dinner, it was etouffee and rice out of the foil pouch, washed down with hot chocolate and a few squirts of red wine from Jeremy's Boda bag. The next day, the whole day through, they didn't bother with clothes at all. They couldn't swim, of course, the lake was too cold for that, but they could bask and explore and feel the breeze out of the south on their bare legs and the places where no breeze had touched before. She would remember that always, the feel of that, the intensity of her emotions, the simple, unrefined pleasure of living in the moment. Wood smoke, dueling flashlights in the night, the look on Jeremy's face when he presented her with the bag of finger-sized crayfish he'd spent all morning collecting. What else? The rain, of course. It came midway through the 3rd day, the clouds the color of iron filings, the lake hammered to iron too, and the storm that crashed through the trees and beat at their tent with 1,000 angry fists. They huddled in the sleeping bag, sharing the wine and a bag of trail mix, reading to each other from a book of Donne's love poems. She was writing a paper for Mrs. Masterson called Ocular Imagery in the Poetry of John Donne, and the last third of a vampire novel that weighed 18.1 ounces. And the sex. They were careful, always careful. "I will never be one of those breeders that bring their puffed-up, squalling little red-faced babies to class," she told him, and he agreed, got adamant about it even, until it became a running theme in their relationship, the breeders overpopulating an overpopulated world and ruining their own lives in the process. But she had forgotten to pack her pills, and he had only 2 condoms with him, and it wasn't as if there were a drugstore around the corner. In the fall, or the end of August, actually, they packed their cars separately and left for college, he to Providence and she to Binghamton. They were separated by 300 miles, but there was the telephone, there was email, and for the first month or so there were Saturday nights in a motel in Danbury. But that was a haul, it really was, and they both agreed that they should focus on their coursework and cut back to every 2nd or maybe 3rd week. On the day they'd left, and no, she didn't want her parents driving her up there, she was an adult and she could take care of herself. Jeremy followed her as far as the Bear Mountain Bridge, and they pulled off the road and held each other till the sun fell down into the trees. She had a poem for him, a Donne poem, the saddest thing he'd ever heard. It was something about the moon. More than moon, that was it. Lovers parting, and their tears swelling like an ocean till the girl, the woman, the female, had more power to raise the tides than the moon itself, or some such. More than moon. That's what he called her after that, because she was white and round and getting rounder, and it was no joke, and it was no term of endearment. She was pregnant. Pregnant, they figured, since the camping trip, and it was their secret, a new constant in their lives, a fact, an inescapable fact, that they never varied, no matter how many home pregnancy kits they went through. Baggy clothes, that was the key. All black, cargo pants, flowing dresses, a jacket, even in summer. They went to a store in the city where nobody knew them, and she got a girdle. And then she went away to school in Binghamton, and he went to Providence. You've got to get rid of it, he told her in the motel room that had become a prison. Go to a clinic, he told her for the 100th time. And outside it was raining. Or, no, it was clear and cold that night, a foretaste of winter. I'll find the money, you know I will. She wouldn't respond, wouldn't even look at him. One of the Star Wars movies was on TV, great, flat, thundering planes of metal roaring across the screen, and she was just sitting there on the edge of the bed, her shoulders hunched and hair hanging limp. Someone slammed a car door, 2 doors in rapid succession, and a child's voice shouted, Me first! China, he said, are you listening to me? I can't, she murmured, and she was talking to her lap, to the bed, to the floor. I'm scared, I'm so scared. There were footsteps in the room next door, ponderous and heavy, then the quick tattoo of the child's feet, and a sudden thump against the wall. I don't want anyone to know, she said. He could have held her, could have squeezed in beside her, and wrapped her in his arms, but something flared in him. He couldn't understand it, he just couldn't. What are you thinking? Nobody'll know. He's a doctor, for Christ's sake, sworn to secrecy, the doctor-patient compact and all that. What are you going to do? Keep it, huh? Just show up for English 101 with a baby in your lap and say, Hi, I'm the Virgin Mary. She was crying. He could see it in the way her shoulders suddenly crumpled, and now he could hear it too, a soft nasal complaint that went right through him. She lifted her face to him and held out her arms, and he was there beside her, rocking her back and forth in his arms. He could feel the heat of her face against the hard fiber of his chest, a wetness there, fluids, her fluids. I don't want a doctor, she said. And that colored everything, that simple negative. Life in the dorms, roommates, bars, bullshit sessions, the smell of burning leaves and the way the light fell across the campus in great, wide, smoking bands just before dinner, the unofficial skateboard club, films, lectures, pep rallies, football. None of it mattered. He couldn't have a life, couldn't be a freshman, couldn't wake up in the morning and tumble into the slow, steady current of the world. All he could think of was her, or not simply her and him, and what had come between them. Because they argued now. They wrangled and fought and debated, and it was no pleasure to see her in that motel room with the queen-size bed and the big color TV and the soaps and shampoos they made off with as if they were treasure. She was pig-headed, stubborn, irrational. She was spoiled. He could see that now. Spoiled by her parents and their standard of living and the socioeconomic expectations of her class, of his class, and the promise of life as you like it, an unscrolling vista of pleasure and acquisition. He loved her. He didn't want to turn his back on her. He would be there for her no matter what, but why did she have to be so stupid? Big sweats, huge sweats, sweats that drowned and engulfed her. That was her campus life, sweats and the dining hall. Her dorm mates didn't know her, and so what if she was putting on weight? Everybody did. How could you shovel down all those carbohydrates, all that sugar and grease, and the puddings and nachos and all the rest, without putting on 10 or 15 pounds the first semester alone? Half the girls in the dorm were waddling around like the doughboy, their faces bloated and blotched with acne, with crusting pimples and whiteheads fed on fat. So she was putting on weight, big deal. There's more of me to love, she told her roommate, and Jeremy likes it that way, and really, he's the only one that matters. She was careful to shower alone in the early mornings, long before the light had begun to bump up against the windows. On the night her water broke, it was mid-December, almost 9 months as best as she could figure. It was raining hard. All week she'd been having tense, rasping, sotto voce debates with Jeremy on the phone, arguments, fights. And she told him that she would die, creep out into the woods like some animal and bleed to death before she'd go to a hospital. And what am I supposed to do? He demanded in a high, childish whine, as if he were the one who'd been knocked up, and she didn't want to hear it. She didn't. Do you love me? She whispered. There was a long hesitation, a pause you could have poured all the affirmation of the world into. Yes, he said finally, his voice so soft and reluctant. It was the last gasp of a dying old man. "Then you're going to have to rent the motel." "And then what?" "Then, I don't know." The door was open, her roommate framed there in the hall, a burst of rock and roll coming at her like an assault. "I guess you'll have to get a book or something." By 8, the rain had turned to ice, and every branch of every tree was coated with it, the highway littered with glistening black sticks. No moon, no stars, the tires sliding out from under her, and she felt heavy, big as a sumo wrestler, heavy and loose at the same time. She'd taken a towel from the dorm and put it under her on the seat, but it was a mess. Everything was a mess. She was cramping, fidgeting with her hair. She tried the radio, but it was no help. Nothing but songs she hated, singers that were worse. 22 miles to Danbury, and the first of the contractions came like a seizure, like a knife blade thrust into her spine. Her world narrowed to what the headlights would show her. Jeremy was waiting for her at the door to the room, the light behind him a pale rinse of nothing, no smile on his face, no human expression at all. They didn't kiss, they didn't even touch, and then she was on the bed on her back, her face clenched like a fist. She heard the rattle of the sleet at the window, the murmur of the TV. "I can't let you go like this," a man protested, and she could picture him angular and tall, a man in a hat and an overcoat, and a black and white world that might have been on another planet. "I just can't." "Are you—" Jeremy's voice drifted into the mix and then stalled. "Are you ready? I mean, is it time? Is it coming now?" She said one thing then, one thing only, her voice as pinched and hollow as the sound of the wind in the gutters. "Get it out of me." It took a moment, and then she could feel his hands fumbling with her sweats. Later, hours later, when nothing had happened but pain, a parade of pain with drum majors and brass bands and penitents crawling on their hands and knees till the streets were stained with their blood, she cried out and cried out again. "It's like Alien," she gasped. "Like that thing in Alien when it's okay," he kept telling her. "It's okay." But his face betrayed him. He looked scared, looked as if he'd been drained of blood in some evil experiment in yet another movie, and a part of her wanted to be sorry for him. But another part, the part that was so commanding and fierce it overrode everything else, couldn't begin to be. He was useless, and he knew it. He'd never been so purely sick at heart and terrified in all his life. But he managed to be there for her, tried to do his best, and when the baby came out, the baby girl, all slick with blood and mucus and the lumped white stuff that was like something spilled at the bottom of a garbage can. He was thinking of the 9th grade and how close he'd come to fainting while the teacher went around the room to prick their fingers one by one so they could each smear a drop of blood across a slide. He didn't faint now, but he was close to it, so close he could feel the room dodging away under his feet. And then her voice, the first intelligible thing she'd said in an hour. "Get rid of it. Just get rid of it." Of the drive back to Binghamton, he remembered nothing, or practically nothing. They took towels from the motel and spread them across the seat of her car. He could remember that much. And the blood, how could he forget the blood? It soaked through her sweats and the towels, and even the thick cotton bath mat, and into the worn fabric of the seat itself. And it all came from inside her, all of it. Tissue and mucus, and the shining bright fluid, no end to it, as if she'd been turned inside out. He wanted to ask her about that, if that was normal, but she was asleep the minute she slid out from under his arm and dropped into the seat. If he focused, if he really concentrated, he could remember the way her head lolled against the door frame, while the engine whined and the car rocked, and the slush threw a blanket over the windshield every time a truck shot past in the opposite direction. That and the exhaustion. He'd never been so tired, his head on a string, shoulders slumped, his arms like 2 pillars of concrete. And what if he'd nodded off? What if he'd gone into a skid and hurtled them into an embankment, into the filthy, gray accumulation of the worst day of his life? What then? She made it into the dorm under her own power. Nobody even looked at her, and no, she didn't need his help. "Call me," she whispered, and they kissed. her lips so cold it was like kissing a steak through the plastic wrap. And then he parked her car in the student lot and walked to the bus station. He made Danbury late that night, caught a ride out to the motel, and walked right through the Do Not Disturb sign on the door. 15 minutes. That was all it took. He bundled up everything, every trace, left the key in the box at the desk, and stood scraping the ice off the windshield of his car while the night opened up above him to a black glitter of sky. He never gave a thought to what lay discarded in the dumpster out back, itself wrapped in plastic. So much meat, so much cold meat. He was at the very pinnacle of his dream, the river dressed in its currents, the deep hole under the cut bank, and the fish like silver bullets swarming to his bait, when they woke him, when Rob woke him, Rob Greiner, his roommate, Rob with a face of crumbling stone, and 2 policemen there at the door behind him, and the roar of the dorm falling away to a whisper. And that was strange, policemen, a real anomaly in that setting, and at first, for the first 30 seconds at least, he had no idea what they were doing there. Parking tickets, could that be it? But then they asked him his name just to confirm it, joined his hands together behind his back, and fitted 2 loops of naked metal over his wrists, and he began to understand. He saw McCaffrey and Tuttle from across the hall staring at him as if he were Jeffrey Dahmer or something, and the rest of them, all the rest, every head poking out of every door up and down the corridor as the police led him away. "What's this all about?" he kept saying, the cruiser nosing through the black streets to the station house, the man at the wheel and the man beside him as incapable of speech as the seats or the wire mesh or the gleaming black dashboard that dragged them forward into the night. And then it was up the steps into an explosion of light, more men in uniform, "Stand here, give me your hand, now the other one," and then the cage and the questions. Only then did he think of that thing in the garbage sack, and the sound it had made, its body had made, when he flung it into the dumpster, like a sack of flour, and the lid slammed down on it. He stared at the walls, and this was a movie too. He'd never been in trouble before, never been inside a police station, but he knew his role well enough because he'd seen it played out 1,000 times on the tube. Deny everything. Even as the 2 detectives settled in across from him at the bare wooden table in the little box of the overlit room, he was telling himself that. Deny it all. The first detective leaned forward and set his hands on the table as if he'd come for a manicure. He was in his 30s or maybe his 40s, a tired-looking man with the scars of the turmoil he'd witnessed gouged into the flesh under his eyes. He didn't offer a cigarette. "I don't smoke," Jeremy was prepared to say, giving them that much at least. And he didn't smile or soften his eyes. And when he spoke, his voice carried no freight at all, not outrage or threat or cajolery. It was just a voice, flat and tired. "Do you know a China Berkowitz?" he said. And she was in the community hospital, where the ambulance had deposited her after her roommates had called 911, in a voice that was like a bone stuck in the back of her throat, and it was raining again. Her parents were there, her mother red-eyed and sniffling, her father looking like an actor who has forgotten his lines. And there was another woman there, too, a policewoman. The policewoman sat in an orange plastic chair in the corner, dipping her head into the knitting in her lap. At first, China's mother had tried to be pleasant to the woman, but pleasant wasn't what the circumstances called for, and now she ignored her, because the very unpleasant fact was that China was being taken into custody as soon as she was released from the hospital. For a long while no one said anything. Everything had already been said, over and over, one long flood of hurt and recrimination. And the antiseptic silence of the hospital held them in its grip, while the rain beat at the windows and the machines at the foot of the bed counted off numbers. From down the hall came a snatch of TV dialogue, and for a moment China opened her eyes and thought she was back in the dorm. "Honey," her mother said, raising a purgatorial face to her, "are you all right? Can I get you anything?" I think I need to pee." "Why?" her father demanded. and it was the perfect non sequitur. He was up out of the chair, standing over her, his eyes like cracked porcelain. Why didn't you tell us, or at least tell your mother, or Dr. Fredman? Dr. Fredman, at least. He's been like a member of the family, you know, and he could have... What were you thinking, for Christ's sake? Thinking? She wasn't thinking anything. Not then, and not now. All she wanted, and she didn't care what they did to her, beat her, torture her, drag her weeping through the streets in a dirty white dress with baby killers stitched over her breast in scarlet letters, was to see Jeremy. Just that. Because what really mattered was what he was thinking. The food at the Sarah Barnes Cooper Women's Correctional Institute was exactly what they served at the dining hall in college. Heavy on the sugars, starches, and bad cholesterol. And that would have struck her as ironic if she'd been there under other circumstances, doing community outreach, say, or researching a paper for a sociology class. But given the fact she'd been locked up for more than a month now, the object of the other girls' threats, scorns, and just plain nastiness, given the fact that her life was ruined beyond any hope of redemption, and every newspaper in the country had her shrunken, white face plastered across its front page under a headline that screamed, "Motel Mom," she didn't have much use for irony. She was scared 24 hours a day. Scared of the present, scared of the future, scared of the reporters waiting for the judge to set bail so they could swarm all over her the minute she stepped out the door. She couldn't concentrate on the books and magazines her mother brought her, or even on the TV in the rec room. She sat in her room. It was just a room, just like a dorm room, except they locked you in at night, and stared at the walls, eating peanuts, M&Ms, sunflower seeds by the handful, chewing for the pure animal gratification of it. She was putting on more weight, and what did it matter? Jeremy was different. He'd lost everything. His walk, his smile, the muscles of his upper arms and shoulders. Even his hair lay flat now, as if he couldn't bother with a tube of gel and a comb. When she saw him at the arraignment, saw him for the first time since she'd climbed out of the car and limped into the dorm with the blood wet on her legs, he looked like a refugee, like a ghost. The room they were in, the courtroom, seemed to have grown up around them, walls, windows, benches, lights, and radiators already in place, along with the judge, the American flag, and the ready-made spectators. It was hot. People coughed into their fists and shuffled their feet, every sound magnified. The judge presided, his arms like bones twirled in a bag, his eyes searching and opaque as he peered over the top of his reading glasses. China's lawyer didn't like Jeremy's lawyer, that much was evident, and the state prosecutor didn't like anybody. She watched him, Jeremy, only him, as the reporters held their collective breath, and the judge read off the charges, and her mother bowed her head and sobbed into the bucket of her hands. And Jeremy was watching her too, his eyes locked on hers as if he defied them all, as if nothing mattered in the world but her. And when the judge said first-degree murder and murder by abuse or neglect, he never flinched. She sent him a note that day. "I love you. I will always love you, no matter what, more than Moon." And in the hallway afterward, while their lawyers fended off the reporters and the bailiffs tugged impatiently at them, they had a minute, just a minute, to themselves. "What did you tell them?" he whispered. His voice was a rasp, almost a growl. She looked at him inches away and hardly recognized him. "I told them it was dead. My lawyer, Mrs. Teagues, she says they're saying it was alive when we put it in the bag." His face was composed, but his eyes were darting like insects trapped inside his head. "It was dead. It looked dead," he said, and already he was pulling away from her, and some callous shit with a camera kept annihilating them with the flash after flash of light. We didn't slap it or anything to get it breathing. And then the last thing he said to her, just as they were pulled apart, and it was nothing she wanted to hear, nothing that had any love in it, or even the hint of love. "You told me to get rid of it." There was no elaborate name for the place where they were keeping him. It was known as Drumhill Prison, period. No reform-minded notions here. No verbal gestures towards rehabilitation or behavior modification. No benefactors, mayors, or role models to lead the place to their family names. But then, who in his right mind would want a prison named after him anyway? At least they kept him separated from the other prisoners, the gangbangers and dope dealers and sexual predators and the like. He was no longer a freshman at Brown, not officially, but he had his books and his course notes, and he tried to keep up as best he could. Still, when the screams echoed through the cell block at night and the walls dripped with the accumulated breath of 8,500 terminally angry sociopaths, he had to admit it wasn't the sort of college experience he'd bargained for. And what had he done to deserve it? He still couldn't understand. That thing in the dumpster, and he refused to call it human, let alone a baby, was nobody's business but his and China's. That's what he told his attorney, Mrs. Teagues, and his mother and her boyfriend Howard, and he'd told them over and over again, I didn't do anything wrong. Even if it was alive, and it was, he knew in his heart that it was, even before the state prosecutor presented evidence of blunt force trauma and death by asphyxiation and exposure, it didn't matter, or shouldn't have mattered. There was no baby. There was nothing but a mistake clothed in blood and mucus. When he really thought about it, thought it through on its merits, and dissected all his mother's pathetic arguments about where he'd be today if she'd felt as he did when she was pregnant herself, he hardened like a rock, like sand turning into stone under all the pressure the planet can bring to bear. Another unwanted child in an overpopulated world. They should have given him a medal. It was the end of January before bail was set, $350,000 his mother didn't have, and he was released to house arrest. He wore a plastic anklet that set off an alarm if he went out the door. And so did she, so did China, imprisoned like some fairy princess at her parents' house. At first she called him every day, but mostly what she did was cry. I want to see it, she sobbed. I want to see our daughter's grave. That froze him inside. He tried to picture her now, China, the love of his life, and he couldn't. What did she look like? What was her face like, her nose, her hair, her eyes and breasts, and the slit between her legs? He drew a blank. There was no way to summon her all the way she used to be, or even the way she was in court, because all he could remember was the thing that had come out of her, 4 limbs and the equipment of a female, shoulders rigid and eyes shut tight, as if she were a mummy in a tomb, and the breath, the shuddering, long, gasping rattle of a breath he could feel ringing inside her, even as the black plastic bag closed over her face and the lid of the dumpster opened like a mouth. He was in the den, watching basketball, a drink in his hand, 7-Up mixed with Jack Daniels in a ceramic mug, so no one would know he was getting shit-faced at 2 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, when the phone rang. It was Sarah Teagues. Listen, Jeremy, she said in her crisp, equitable tones. I thought you ought to know. The Berkowitzes are filing a motion to have the case against China dropped. His mother's voice on the portable, too loud, blast of amplified breath and static. On what grounds? She never saw the baby, that's what they're saying. She thought she had a miscarriage. Yeah, right, his mother said. Sarah Teagues was right there, her voice as clear and present as his mother's. Jeremy's the one that threw it in the dumpster, and they're saying he acted alone. She took a polygraph test day before yesterday. He could feel his heart pounding like it used to when he plodded up that last agonizing ridge behind the school with the cross-country team, his legs sapped, no more breath left in his body. He didn't say a word, didn't even breathe. She's going to testify against him. Outside was the world, puddles of ice clinging to the lawn under a weak afternoon sun, all the trees stripped bare, the grass dead, the azalea under the window reduced to an armload of dead brown twigs. She wouldn't have wanted to go out today anyway. This was the time of year she hated most, the long interval between the holidays and spring break, when nothing grew and nothing changed. It didn't even seem to snow much anymore. What was out there for her anyway? They wouldn't let her see Jeremy, wouldn't even let her talk to him on the phone or write him anymore, and she wouldn't be able to show her face at the mall or even the movie theater without somebody shouting out her name as if she were a freak, as if she were Monica Lewinsky or Heidi Fleiss. She wasn't China Berkowitz's honor students, not anymore. She was the punchline to a joke, a footnote to history. She wouldn't mind going for a drive, though. That was something she missed, just following the curves out to the reservoir to watch the way the ice cupped the shore, or up to the turnabout on Route 9 to look out over the river where it oozed through the mountains in a shimmering coil of light, or to take a walk in the woods, just that. She was in her room on her bed, posters of bands she'd outgrown staring down from the walls, her high school books on 2 shelves in the corner, the closet floor flung open, all the clothes she'd once wanted so desperately she could have died for each individual pair of boots, or the cashmere sweaters that felt so good against her skin. At the bottom of her left leg, down there at the foot of the bed, was the anklet she wore now, the plastic anklet with the transmitter inside, no different, she supposed, than the collars they put on wolves to track them across all those miles of barren tundra, or the bears sleeping in their dens, except that hers had an alarm on it. For a long while she just lay there gazing out the window, watching the rinsed-out sun slip down into the sky that had no more color in it than a TV tuned to an unsubscribed channel. And then she found herself picturing things the way they were an eon ago, when everything was green. She saw the azalea bush in bloom, the leaves knifing out of the trees, the butterflies, or were they cabbage moths, hovering over the flowers, deep green. That was the color of the world. And she was remembering a night, summer before last, just after she and Jeremy started going together, the crickets thrumming, the air thick with humidity, and him singing along with the car radio, his voice so sweet and pure it was as if he'd written the song himself just for her. And when they got to where they were going, the end of that dark lane overhung with trees, to a place where it was private and hushed, and the night fell in on itself as if it couldn't support the weight of the stars, he was as nervous as she was. She moved into his arms and they kissed, his lips groping for hers in the dark, his fingers trembling over the thin, yielding silk of her blouse. He was Jeremy. He was the love of her life. And she closed her eyes and clung to him, as if that were all that mattered.